stand with you. In the last week, I've spoken with Mayor Savage of Halifax, Mayor Locke of Shelburne, and Premier Houston, as well as with Premier Smith and other local leaders. Il y a 2 jours, j'ai parlé avec le Premier ministre Legault de la
2 days ago, I spoke with Premier Legault about the wildfire situation in Quebec. I also talked with the mayor and Le Serre and the head of Nouakchott, Matam, Mike McKenzie. We spoke about the situation on the ground. As you are aware, members of the armed forces have already been deployed to help. Several wildfires cannot be predicted, so it's important to listen to local authorities to make sure that everyone stays safe.
Government is here to help. So far, we've approved 3 requests for federal assistance in Alberta, in Nova Scotia, and in Quebec. This includes deploying Canadian Armed Forces members for things like personnel to aid in firefighting roles, airlift resources, and engineering support. Minister Blair will go into more detail about the status of this work in a moment on what we're doing to keep people safe right now. Year after year, with climate change, we're seeing more and more intense wildfires, and in places where they don't normally happen. That's why we've invested to train more community-based firefighters across the country. For example, we've worked with the Yukon First Nations Wildfire Partnership to train 130 wildland firefighters in Yukon and northern British Columbia. In Newfoundland and Labrador, we partnered with the Innu Nation to train community members. In Manitoba, in Ontario, and in many other places, our support allowed more firefighters to be trained. And last week, we announced that through the Wildfire Training Fund, we're supporting over 300 Indigenous firefighters and 125 Indigenous fire guardians to be hired and trained this season. À travers le Centre Interservices des Feux de Forêt.
Through the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Center, we are collaborating with other countries to fight against the wildfires here and throughout the country. For example, in the past, we sent Canadian firefighters to support firefighters in other countries like the United States and Australia. And since we are facing very intensive fires here, we are receiving hundreds of firefighters from other countries to support us.
Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and France for the firefighters they've already sent and will continue to send over the coming days and weeks. And on top of that, we're engaging further with other international partners about more reinforcements over the coming weeks. Before I end, I know there's a lot of Canadians who are asking how they can help too. The federal government and the government of Alberta are coordinating a donation matching program with the Canadian Red Cross 2023 Alberta Fires Appeal. So every dollar donated will become $3 in support to those affected by wildfire in Alberta. And as announced last week, we will set up similar donation matching programs to help people in the Northwest Territories and in Nova Scotia. This is a difficult time for many Canadians. If you have friends or family members who are affected, it's important to continue being there for one another. I want to thank the volunteers, first responders, CAF members, and of course the firefighters who are doing their work like the true professionals they are. I know that firefighters are often away from their family. I was talking with the CDS, the Chief of Defence Staff, about how some CAF members are personally affected by fires. Some have had their homes damaged, some have seen their families evacuated. But despite all of this, they continue to step up to help and protect others. Thank you. To all Canadians, let's continue supporting our firefighters by listening to local authorities. And across the board, whether it's with members of the armed forces, to Parks Canada resources, to firefighters and equipment, the Coast Guard, Health Canada, and the Service Canada support, which Minister Gould will speak about shortly, our government is standing up support to keep people safe today and for wildfire seasons to come. I'll now turn it over to Minister Blair. Merci tout le monde. Bill.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Bon après-midi tout le monde.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Begin by providing a bit of a situational update. To date, there have been 2,214 wildfires nationally so far this year, and approximately 3.3 million hectares have been burned. And across the country, there are currently 413 wildfires burning, and 249 of those fires are deemed out of control. There are also 18 active wildfires specifically impacting First Nations, with 6 in Alberta, 5 in Saskatchewan, 1 in the Northwest Territories, 4 in Quebec, and 2 in Nova Scotia. And as of yesterday, an estimated 26,000 people remain evacuated from their homes across the country. I will acknowledge that the images that we have seen so far this season are some of the most severe ever witnessed in Canada, and the current forecast for the next few months indicates the potential for continued higher than normal fire activity. Releasing the information that we're providing today will allow people and governments to prepare, and because they know that when they are prepared, we can reduce the risk that these events pose, and it enables us to position the resources and the supports the Canadians may need and be ready to mobilize them if a situation requires it. The Government Operations Centre supports the planning work and provides stable, around-the-clock coordination of the federal response to all emergencies. They constantly monitor evolving risks and liaise with the provincial and territory officials to ensure a swift, smooth, and coordinated approach to provide any federal aid a province or territory may require, including by reaching across the entire federal system to activate different supports that any jurisdiction may need. And through the exceptional work of the Government Operations Centre, we have been able to respond quickly to requests for federal assistance from both Nova Scotia and from Quebec. And this, of course, is in addition to the request that we approved from the province of Alberta last month, and it has led to the mobilization of Canadian Armed Forces personnel and assets in both provinces, with further supports being provided by other federal departments and agencies. And for example, in Alberta, there are roughly 150 soldiers currently deployed in support of firefighting tasks in the Fox Creek region and in Fort Chipewyan. In Quebec, there are now 150 soldiers deployed to the Sept-Îles region. And in Nova Scotia, we have provided ignition specialist personnel and equipment to support their efforts, and an immediate response unit consisting of 200 soldiers from the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Canadian Regiment, and they have now completed the necessary Type 3 firefighting training. They're ready to immediately deploy from CFB Gagetown, and once the province assesses that conditions are suitable and safe, they will continue and commence firefighting operations. In addition, firefighting support is also being coordinated by the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre, commonly referred to as CIFC. And since 1982, CIFC has coordinated the sharing of firefighting resources between the federal, provincial, and territorial agencies responsible for wildland fire management and with our international partners, as the Prime Minister indicated. These resources are shared on a formal basis through a mutual aid agreement which outlines 3 categories of resources. They provide support of equipment, personnel, and aircraft. And during periods of escalating wildland fire activity, CIFC matches the agencies that have specific resource needs with the agencies that have resources available. This season, personnel and resources have already been deployed between provinces and territories. And as the Prime Minister acknowledged, we are very grateful for the support Canada has received from our international partners, including Australia, the United States, New Zealand, South Africa, and other countries to come. We are expecting further deployments from these countries, including France, in the coming days and weeks, and we have been assured that CIFC continues to find the necessary firefighters, personnel, and assets to support the firefighting operations across Canada. In addition to the work of CIFC and Canadian Armed Forces, Public Services and Procurement Canada is working closely with the Government Operations Centre and stands by to provide technical support and expertise in civil engineering for bridges, buildings, or other damaged critical infrastructure. PSPC can also provide emergency contracting support for goods and services, air assets, and temporary accommodations, as well as warehousing service for emergency stockpile and equipment, which may be required to support the response. NGOs, including the Canadian Red Cross, are supporting multiple regions across the country. Community organizations and local volunteers are providing essential support, care, and compassion to people who are under immense personal stress, and their work represents a key component of Canada's response to these emergencies. With federal and provincial contributions, our matching program with the Government of Alberta and the Canadian Red Cross has raised over $22 million. And we have also committed, as the Prime Minister indicated, to similar matching programs with Nova Scotia and the Northwest Territories. I want Canadians to know that all orders of government are working closely together, with your safety in mind and with a high degree of cooperation and collaboration. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank my provincial and territorial counterparts and all of the municipal leaders that we've spoken to for their excellent partnership and hard work. The situation remains serious, but there have been some very positive developments over the weekend. On Saturday, Alberta rescinded their provincial state of emergency, Rain and cooler temperatures have brought much needed relief to Nova Scotia. And to the firefighters, first responders, search and rescue personnel, members of the Canadian Armed Forces who continue to move into danger to keep our communities safe, we recognize your heroic service to Canadians, and we offer you all our collective thanks. Thank you very much. Merci. I'd like now to turn it over to my colleague, Minister Wilkinson.
Thank you, Minister Blair. Good morning, everyone. I also want to acknowledge the incredibly challenging circumstances that folks across the country are facing and the ongoing efforts of firefighters, volunteers, and everyday Canadians who are stepping up to support each other. As I said last week, the federal government is here to support Canadians and at-risk communities throughout this year's fire season and into the future. À cette fin, Ressources Naturelles Canada.
Natural Resources Canada is therefore working in close collaboration with different partners to develop a model that predicts wildfire dangers throughout the year. These models are regularly updated and made available to the public to ensure that they are as precise and timely as possible.
We released our updated modeling for the wildfire season. It is, in a word, sobering. It shows that the risk of wildfires is set to increase in June and remain unusually high throughout the summer across the country. It shows us that this year's already devastating season could well get worse. It is important to note that this model anticipates risk levels, not actual fires. With good fortune, it is possible that the full extent of the risk does not materialize, but with preparation, we must be ready for whatever happens this year and into the future. Every province and territory will need to be on high alert throughout this wildfire season. While this is not yet Canada's most severe fire season, if this trajectory continues, it very well could be. In terms of historic averages of area burned, we have seen 10 times normal so far. Going forward, as usual, Natural Resources Canada will continue to update its modeling to keep all Canadians apprised. While provinces and territories have primary responsibility for firefighting personnel and equipment, this federal government has recognized that additional firefighting resources will most certainly be required moving forward. We have also recognized the need for work to help at-risk communities adapt to the impact of a changing climate. C'est pourquoi le budget.
That is why the 2022 federal budget committed $516 million for wildfire mitigation, response, and surveillance, and to improve the federal coordination during emergency response.
To enable provinces and territories to buy specialized firefighting equipment, to train new firefighters, and to incorporate Indigenous traditional knowledge in our fire management systems. This past year, we contributed to 6 provinces and territories to acquire firefighting equipment. This has been critical for our counterparts in the procurement of vital resources such as vehicles, mobile units, avionics upgrades, hoses, pumps, and enhanced communication equipment. It's expected all provinces and territories will participate in the fund this year. And last week, I announced that under the first phase of our wildfire training program, we had signed agreements with 9 Indigenous communities and organizations to help train more than 300 Indigenous firefighters and 125 Indigenous fire guardians all across Canada. As I noted last Thursday, and in light of the urgent wildfire conditions in Canada, my department is pleased to be working with the International Association of Firefighters to advance a pilot project that would increase Canada's wildfire fighting capacity. This project will be focused on training structural firefighters to respond to fires in the wildland-urban interface due to the particular risks those fires pose to homes, communities, and infrastructure. Le travail se poursuit sur tous ces.
Work is continuing on all fronts, and we intend to send as many firefighters as possible on the ground. This means more people with the skills, knowledge, and expertise in communities that need it most.
Natural Resources Canada will continue to monitor and to model wildfires and wildfire risks in Canada. We are also going to enhance our abilities to do so with the $170 million investment in WildfireSat satellite mission, the world's first purpose-built public satellite system for monitoring fires, which is targeted to launch in 2029. Once operational, Wildfire Sat will help reduce wildfire losses, help us defend communities and avoid unnecessary evacuations, allow us to better protect our resources, infrastructure, and environment, inform emergency decisions, reduce health problems associated with smoke and air pollution, and help prevent more disastrous fires. Les incendies de forêt ont
Wildfires certainly took place before we started to clearly see the acceleration of the effects of climate change. However, we are now experiencing a new reality, one where we need to pay attention to what science is telling us.
been there to provide assistance to provinces and territories that require near-term support. In the long term, we are also making investments in building the capabilities that Canadians will most certainly need going forward. Canada has made combating wildfires a high priority over the last number of years, and with the accelerating impact of climate change, we very much will continue to do so moving forward. Thank you very much. And now over to my colleague, Minister Gould.
Thank you, Minister Wilkinson. I too would like to join my voice of gratitude to all those who are involved in the emergency response, especially as many of them are facing very challenging situations in their own personal lives as well. As my colleagues have said, as the wildfire situation across Canada evolves, we will continue to make every effort to help and support those impacted. Emploi et Développement Social Canada.
Employment and Social Development Canada has set up an intervention group to manage emergencies, to coordinate and plan our response to wildfires and maintain services being offered to Canadians. We are focusing on service provision to Canadians affected by the wildfire situation. We need to show proof of flexibility to allow quicker access to services and to provide services as quickly as possible through direct deposits using mobile services and Service Canada.
Outreach units to evacuation centers to support applications for services such as employment insurance. For those affected by the wildfires, ESDC continues to deliver and prioritize applications for income support, including EI, OAS, GIS, and Canada Pension Plan. We have also put in place additional procedures to facilitate EI claims where employers are not able to issue records of employment or where paper checks may not be deliverable due to the wildfires. In addition, Service Canada is actively conducting wellness checks on temporary foreign workers. We're checking on them by contacting their employers. Si vous êtes un travailleur affecté par
If you are a worker affected by the wildfires, I strongly encourage you to apply for an employment insurance benefit online, by telephone, or in person as soon as possible. Even if you do not have your employment document, your applications will be processed as a priority.
wildfires. Apply for EI benefits online, by phone, or in person. Even if you do not have your record of employment, your application will be prioritized. If you are an EI, CPP, or OAS recipient who has not signed up yet for direct deposit, I strongly encourage you to do so you can receive your benefits sooner. La livraison des chèques papier.
Delivery of paper checks by the postal service may be disrupted because of the affected zones. You could register for a direct deposit by sending an application through Service Canada. A worker would contact you 2 days after your application. You could also communicate with the call center responsible for the benefit you receive.
You can submit an eService Canada request online to get help with many services, including but not limited to CPP, your social insurance number, passports, and Ukraine immigration measures. Service Canada employees are also available to help through the Service Canada Outreach Support Centre. The toll-free number is 1-877-631-2657. Nous savons que les prévisions.
We know that predictions indicate that there's going to be extreme wildfires throughout Canada. Service Canada employees will continue being there to support all those who are affected by the wildfires.
These support services to anyone, anywhere in Canada who has been affected by these wildfires. You are not alone. Please do not hesitate to reach out to a Service Canada Centre or the Outreach Support Centre if you need assistance. We are here for you. Thank you. Merci.
Donc, on va maintenant passer à la période
Now we'll start with questions.
of 15 minutes, and then the ministers will stay until about 1 o'clock. So we will start in the room, and then we will go virtually. Those who are connected can use the raise hand function. Alors, on va commencer avec Ashley.
We'll start with Ashley Burks, CBC.
Prime Minister, right now it takes about 4 to 5 days to train Canadian Armed Forces members who don't have training already in areas like Nova Scotia. Is that fast enough? And in light of what we're seeing right now, should the Canadian Armed Forces play more of an active, specialized role and a bigger role in fighting fires here in Canada?
The Canadian Armed Forces have demonstrated their capacity to respond to extreme weather events, unfortunately, all too often over the past years, and have developed extraordinary expertise in supporting provincial firefighters and other emergency responders. It is true that there has been a greater concentration of forest fires, wildfires out west in recent years than in Atlantic Canada, but through training and through transfers of CAF personnel from the west to east, the Canadian Armed Forces are more than able to respond to the necessary challenges. For the longer term, we're going to continue to look at lessons learned, including through this difficult summer, to make sure that we are ready to face the increased risk of extreme weather events in the coming years.
And Paul Bernardo has been transferred from a maximum security facility to a medium security facility. What do you think of that? And is there anything that your government can do to reverse that?
I fully and totally understand how shocked and appalled so many Canadians are on hearing that news. Minister Mendicino came out very strongly last week, indicating that he was going to find clearer answers and explain to Canadians what happened and what we're going to be doing about it. I leave it to him to follow up on that.
Émilie Bergeron, La Presse Canadienne.
Émilie Bergeron, La Presse Canadienne. Good afternoon, Mr. Prime Minister. Predictions indicate that the wildfire activity could remain higher than normal in July and August. Already, the firefighters are working very hard and have been doing so for weeks throughout the country. And monthly predictions could change, of course. What are you telling those firefighters who are already there and maybe already almost burnt out to make sure that they don't die? Answer, first of all, we tell them, thank you. We know how hard they work year-long to make sure that Canadians are safe, particularly during this wildfire season. They spend extremely long days under very difficult circumstances. Of course, they have our entire support, and we are planning for a succession, and we have people abroad who are sending firefighters to help us. We are in discussions with other countries to make sure that we have resources in the weeks ahead if the season extends beyond the summer. And we will also work in close collaboration with the various jurisdictions and regions to make sure that those who are protecting us from those fires are themselves properly supported and protected. Question, in the same vein, if it continues in July and in August at the level of the Canadian Armed Forces, does Canada have enough resources to make sure that support being sent be able to continue in July and maybe in August? Answer. This is a question we are all thinking about. We are planning for additional resources for the next months. I put the same question to the Chief of Defense Staff when I spoke to him on Friday. Current predictions reassure us that we will have enough resources to deploy throughout the country, but we are aware that the situation can change. So we are preparing a contingency plan. But we know that Canadians can rest assured that we are going to do all that is necessary to protect them throughout the summer?
Given the very serious projections of what this summer's wildfire season could look like, this is a question whether there'll be enough resources for the entire summer for all the potential wildfires that come up. This is actually a question I posed directly to the Chief of Defense Staff when we had a conversation about wildfires on Friday. With the given projections, it is expected that we have enough resources to cover the summer. If things get worse, we are developing contingency plans, and we will, of course, make sure that we are there, whether it's leaning more on international supports, whether it's standing up other resources. We will be there to ensure that all Canadians are protected right through this summer.
Mayor Rapson, CP.
Yes, good afternoon, I guess it is at this point. I'm wondering, given that even the experts earlier today, the fire experts blame climate change for some of this fire activity, the Minister of Natural Resources mentioned that, why has your government continued to approve fossil fuel projects when climate scientists have said that we need to stop doing that?
Our government has put forward some of the most ambitious plans and targets to fight climate change of certainly any previous Canadian government, but also more ambitious than many of our allies around the world, certainly among fossil fuel producing countries. We know, given the international context, including the war on Ukraine, there is going to be a need for fossil fuels and traditional resources for the coming years. At the same time, we are investing more than any other government has in investing in renewables, in new forms and new reliable sources of energy, because we know that getting to net zero by 2050, by hitting our climate targets by 2030, is a way to both protect Canadians from the extreme weather impacts of climate change over the coming decades and ensure great jobs and a competitive economy in a net zero world. Canada can and will be the net zero supplier of choice in the coming decades, and we are investing in order to get there.
The Correctional Service of Canada had the ability to waive the privacy rights of Paul Bernardo in order to explain to Canadians, and particularly the families of the victims in this case, why he was being transferred. Do you think they should have done that, and would your government do anything to make sure that that can happen?
That is exactly the kind of conversations that Minister Mendicino is having with Correctional Services of Canada this week.
Valérie Gamache, Radio-Canada.
Radio-Canada. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. We know that the wildfires will keep growing over the years. Could Canada set up a special squad, a federal special squad, and maybe a special appliance that doesn't belong to the Army? We already have an interagency forest fire center that was in place since over the past few years, and over the years we've increased resources for the operation of this center. And we are constantly looking for ways of responding to this new reality of new wildfires and dealing with extreme weather events over the next few years. For now, we are reacting and responding to this immediate emergency in the country, but reflections have started already to make sure that in the coming years, we will have all the necessary resources we need, and that's part of our reflections. Thank you. Question, we're talking about 12 times more hectares that have been burned over the past 10 years. How much time do you think would Canada need to recover from this situation? We know that communities like Lytton have not yet totally recovered in their municipality. Answer, we know that it takes years to rebuild houses and communities that were affected and burned down by those wildfires. But besides rebuilding, we need to think about building better to make sure that we think about that as at the same time we are increasing houses and creating new residential communities throughout the country. We need to think about the challenges that will come with more extreme weather events and more wildfires in the future. That's part of the conversations we are having with the provinces and cities, together with experts, and we shall continue to participate in all these conversations and solutions.
Brian Basafiume, National Post.
Good afternoon. Can somebody talk a little bit more about engaging First Nations communities in the help of the wildfire fight? Numbers, personnel, how many communities are involved, what sort of things they're doing?
I will turn to other ministers for more details, but I can tell you from my own personal experience, a number of years ago, there was a wildfire in northern BC where there were lots of learnings that we had about making sure that we were properly engaging not just the federal government, but provincial governments with Indigenous communities, with First Nations communities who are not only there to stand and protect their communities, but have expertise that goes back centuries and indeed millennia in terms of knowledge on how to keep their communities safe from wildfires. Over the past years, we have significantly increased the coordination, cooperation with Indigenous leadership and communities in a tripartite way, federal, provincial, and Indigenous, and that will continue. But I think, Bill, you can speak to this.
Yeah, just some numbers. I mentioned some of these before, but there are currently 18 active wildfires that are directly impacting First Nations. Across the country, 6 of those are in Alberta, 5 in Saskatchewan, 1 in the NWT, 4 in Quebec, and 2 in Nova Scotia. There have been already significant evacuations from those communities. There's been some damage to those communities as well as a result of these fires. And there are a number of places as well where the communities are isolated currently, and those are some things that we're dealing with those provincial jurisdictions and with Indigenous Services Canada. We know that, you know, the fire is a naturally occurring event, and particularly in the north, and in many of these communities, quite frankly, that's been part of their history, and they're used to it. But where there's an interface, where that fire comes in close to their communities, when residents are at risk, critical infrastructure is at risk, when bridges and roads are compromised, power and water supplies, all of those things are very impactful. We're working very closely with those communities, but there have been a number of people who've been evacuated from their communities, and we are supporting them currently in other locales.
Second question for the Prime Minister, just a little off topic, but last week we learned that Special Rapporteur David Johnston had hired a PR firm Navigator. In your opinion, is this a good use of public funds?
We've seen, unfortunately, from the beginning of me having appointed a serious Canadian to deal with this serious issue, that the opposition parties, particularly the Conservatives, have chosen to make it about baseless personal attacks and extraordinarily toxic partisanship. I'm not going to speak to decisions that the independent special rapporteur and his team are making to manage the toxic climate that they're operating in. I will continue to stay focused, as will former Governor General David Johnston, on responding to the very real issues around foreign interference, around the very real threat to institutions, to our democracy, to Canadians, to businesses that foreign interference represents. And I will continue to encourage the leader of the official opposition to get a briefing from our intelligence services and agencies so that he can base his critiques and his concerns in facts and not just continue baseless smear jobs against a Canadian of unimpeachable integrity in former Governor General David Johnston.
Annie Bergeron-Oliver, CTV.
Hi. The Conservative leader is threatening to block the budget and bring forward 900 amendments because of what he calls your government's inflation-fueling actions. I'm wondering what you think of this characterization and of the demands that he's made of your government.
The Conservative leader has no plan for the economy, proposes nothing but cuts. When he's blocking the budget that voted on, is passing through the House with support of a majority of parliamentarians, he's blocking things like the doubling of the tax credit for tradespeople on their tools, We know how important it is to get the construction season up and fully running through this summer, and yet the Leader of the Opposition is blocking tax credits for tradespeople for the new tools. He's blocking the anti-flipping measures that we brought in this last budget to protect homeowners and home buyers from speculation. That's going to have a direct impact on Canadians. And he's blocking the enhancement of the Canada Workers' Benefit, which is going to continue to put more money in the pockets of hardworking Canadians who are struggling to get by. These are real-life consequences for the political and partisan games that the Leader of the Official Opposition is engaging in. The Conservative leader stood against dental care for kids. He stood against help to lowest income renters. And now he's standing against all the measures that will help in the budget, proposing instead to cut programs and leave Canadians on their own. That is not how you build a strong economy. It's not how you create great jobs into the future. So we're going to continue to put support for Canadians at the center of everything we do in these difficult times, despite the Conservative leader's effort to harm Canadians so he can attack this government.
And you talked about it briefly in French, but given the increasing risk that we're seeing of wildfires, is your government considering the creation of a national wildfire department with dedicated squadrons, more fire bombers to ensure that communities are better prepared and they can respond faster?
We have since 1982 had CIFC in the Canadian Interagency Firefighting Centre that has, over the past years, grown in importance and relevance. We continue to work with it. Right now, we're very much focused on getting through this difficult season in the immediate and supporting Canadians. But absolutely, as we know, that climate change is going to bring more and more extreme weather events into the future, more dangerous floods, more difficult and devastating wildfires, more intense hurricanes and storms. We are going to need to continue to step up in our support for Canadians. This is why we move forward with a national adaptation strategy that puts billions of dollars on the table to work with municipalities and provinces to build back better, to create more resilience, and to better protect Canadians from the impacts of climate change into the coming decades, at the same time as we remain unequivocal in our fight against climate change. Again, there are some politicians that still think you can have a plan for great jobs and growing the economy without having a plan to fight climate change. But Canadians know that fighting climate change is necessary both to create those great jobs and opportunity, but to also prevent the catastrophic and very expensive losses that Canadians are facing increasingly over the years.
On me dit que c'est tout le temps qu'on a pour le...
I'm told that's all the time we have left for the Prime Minister, but there's one other question in the room if he wants to stay. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you.
Natasha Wilowski.
Hi, I would have rather put this question to the Prime Minister, but seeing as he's gone, I'll ask you, Mr. Guilbeault. The government keeps pointing to confidential reports from TD and BMO, two banks that are involved in financing the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion, to claim that the project is still commercially viable. They won't share these, and I learned that those secret reports are based on a 100-year timeline, assuming that the pipeline will be in operation for 100 years, collecting revenues, when the average lifetime is 40 years. I'm just wondering how the government, and I understand you're not in the finance department, but as they won't answer my questions, I'm hoping you can shed some light on how the government is able to justify using those reports when experts, including the PBO, have said multiple times that a 100-year timeline is just not a realistic lifetime for a pipeline.
Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I don't have those information, but what I can commit to doing is making sure that we get you some answers. I will work with my department, and I will talk to my finance colleague, Minister Freeland, to try and get you those answers as rapidly as possible.
Thank you very much. And as a follow-up on the wildfires, I am I've heard a lot from environmental groups about how one of the problems being faced with huge issues like this is trying to work across silos in government. I know that there has been a lot of work done to coordinate efforts across departments, but as Environment Minister, are there any areas you see where ECCC or other departments could step across those silos even more and try to look to the future past the immediate response to, see what could be done to get ahead of this next year, as we can assume it will get worse?
Thank you. I mean, I think no one here will deny that government or governments have a tendency to work in silos, but I think that we are making a lot of efforts to change that. I'll give you two concrete examples. The emissions reduction plan that the Prime Minister tabled last year was a concerted effort by many of the people on the stage and many other people who aren't on the stage, like Minister Wilkinson and many others. And I know, like, we tend to use the example whole of government, maybe too lightly at times, but that's not one of those instances. Same thing for the National Adaptation Strategy. Minister Blair, myself, Minister Wilkinson, and a number of other departments have been involved in coordinating the development of both the Federal Action Plan on adaptation, which was qualified by the Canadian Insurance Bureau as world leading just last December, and the following National Adaptation Strategy, where we will pull in the work of provinces, territories, Indigenous nations, municipalities, companies, to ensure that when it comes to adaptation, we are, as a nation, better prepared to face the impacts of climate change, which we're not now, and I think none of us would deny that. So we are trying more and more to, certainly on the forest fires, there's a lot of coordination between many of our departments on our respective responsibilities, to ensure that nothing falls through the cracks.
To our moderator, if I may just supplement, just because the question's been on my mind a lot about working across silos and between levels of government as well. I've rarely seen anything like the response I've seen in the past few days. Huge credit to a number of people that you see here. Minister Blair in particular, your responsiveness has no doubt helped save lives of people who live in my home province. To see people break down barriers across silos has been extraordinary. We had, within about a day, Transport Canada have aerial surveillance on the ground. The next day, comfort trailers were set up by the Coast Guard. The following day, helicopters started arriving. There was a pre-existing programs that are funded by a multitude of departments, whether we're talking about CIFC, the NRCan training, the disaster financial assistance arrangement. The Prime Minister called me personally to say that we would be there in whatever way we could. Since then, we've set up the Red Cross matching donation portal. We've got ignition specialists who've landed. DND has, and thank you to Minister Anita Anand for getting planning and coordination efforts there. Immediately deploying the Department of National Defence fire trucks to see that there's now coordination going between governments to help water bombers land at military bases in Nova Scotia. PSPC has jumped in to offer contracting support. The measures that Minister Gould outlined around EI, around other benefits offered through ESDC, even my own department, trying to facilitate the issuance of travel documents. There's no shortage of other examples I could point to. Private helicopters being licensed to help respond in the emergency. Recognizing that a lot of people on the ground are volunteers. In my own constituency, we are covered by about 36 fire departments. All but one are volunteers. To see the responsiveness from my colleagues, and credit to provincial officials, Ministers Laura and Russian. Actually, we gave Minister Laura a ride from the airport from Ottawa downtown today. He's in town for meetings later. There has not been a silo that's existed over the past week of my life in government. It is so deeply encouraging to see that when I make a phone call or send a text, within 90 seconds, I'm receiving substantive responses. This is a model for response, in my view, how we should work across departments. And I just want to say, as a Nova Scotian who spent some of the last few days talking to families who've been displaced, I'm grateful. And to see the leadership, in particular, from Minister Blair in this regard, gives me a lot of faith that we get the right people working on the job.
And moderator, I apologize, but I'm going to jump in here too, because I'd like to take an opportunity just to tip my hat a little bit to the public service. We have an extraordinary public service here in Canada, and their counterparts provincially and municipally right across the country have done an extraordinary job. We've convened a number of tables of senior officials responsible for emergency management, and as well through our own Government Operations Centre, virtually every department of the Government of Canada is at the table. And our senior officials in every department have worked very closely and collaboratively. They've been remarkably not just responsive to what's been taking place, but they're working to anticipate what's going to be needed. The collaboration that Minister Fraser indicated between provinces and municipalities, territories, and First Nations is critical for us to get this done. And we are very blessed in this country to have a remarkable team of dedicated professionals who make that work.
We will now turn to the people online. We have one question from Steve McKinley, Toronto Star. Go ahead, Steve.
Hi there. Question for Minister Wilkinson. When wildfires strike near to wildland-urban interfaces, the cost of those fires goes up exponentially. Now, National Resource Council has put together a guide on a national guide for wildland-urban interface fires. Somebody I spoke to was saying, that's the problem with it is it's just a guide, that some of these things cost money and we can't count on developers to spend more money than they have to. Is there any motivation or any action to turn some of that guide into code, into regulation, into law, or to poke the various provinces into doing so?
You're on mute, Jonathan.
Sorry about that. So thank you for the question. It is an important one. I think in the past, we have often thought of wildland fires as distinct from structural fires that exist in urban communities. And so we have firefighters within the urban communities that are often members of the International Association of Firefighters. We have wildland fighters that are trained by the provinces and territories by and large and by Parks Canada. And we haven't seen a lot of intermixing. We have guidelines, as you say, with respect to practices that can help to try to address some of the risks in the interface. I do think that going forward, we are going to actually have to try to find mechanisms through which we can be a bit more prescriptive, or that we can more strongly encourage some of our provincial and territorial counterparts, who I do know many of them are thinking along these lines, to ensure that we are enabling people to adopt the kinds of practices that will actually help us to reduce fire risks in the interface. Concurrent with that, as I mentioned in my remarks, we actually have started work with the International Association of Firefighters to work in that interface, to actually train structural firefighters in communities across the country on how best to actually think about addressing some of the risks and addressing fires that actually do end up in that interface. So it is an emerging area. It is something we are very live to. It is something that provinces and territories, I think, are increasingly aware of, many of whom are actually dealing with this interface right now. And it is certainly something that's going to get more attention going forward.
Thank you.
Do you have a follow-up, Steve?
No, thanks. I think that's good for me.
Okay. I believe we have one more question in the room from David Turton, CBC. Okay.
Minister Guilbeault, would you pause the federal fuel charge commonly referred to as the carbon tax, especially in Nova Scotia that's been hard hit by wildfires? Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre said today Canadians can no longer afford to pay for heating. He's calling you to, of course, cancel the federal fuel charge. Is this something that you'd be considering maybe at least pausing in Nova Scotia, given? Yeah.
Thank you for the question. It is somewhat unbelievable that as Canada is going through what will likely be the worst year in our country's history in terms of forest fires, and that we know that part of this is because of climate change, and that we collectively, certainly in Canada and around the world, need to do more and accelerate the fight against climate change. The only answer that the Conservative leader has is, let's make pollution free again. Let's do less to fight climate change. I I find it unconscionable that that's the only thing that Pierre Poilievre has to say. And we've been very clear about our plan for many years. We've been deploying this plan, and we've been accompanying our plan with measures to help Canadians make the transition. And in fact, the clean fuel regulations was something that the Conservative Party of Canada had in their platform during the last election, as they did on carbon pricing, saying that it would go up to $170 a ton by 2030. The difference really between us and them is that when it comes to climate change, they're all talk and no action. They have nothing to say about fighting climate change, let alone how do we help Canadians be better prepared to face the impacts of climate change. I have never heard Pierre Poilievre talk about adapting to climate change. Why would he? He doesn't believe in it. His party doesn't believe in it. Members of his party are standing in the House of Commons to say that they don't believe in climate change. Why would they care anything about what we need to do to help Canadians? So I'll stop there.
Do you have a follow-up? Okay, alors c'est toutes les questions qu'on avait pour.
Those are all the questions we had for you today. Thank you for staying a bit longer. Much appreciated.
Recording stopped.